Tips for developing speed on the descent of the squat, struggling with balance at speed. So this is a good question. And when you're squatting, you should be trying to squat as good as you can maintain good technique. So squatting as fast as possible with poor positions is obviously a really bad idea, but squatting as fast as possible with good positions gives you the potential to lift a lot more. It's why we'll see a lot of high bar squatters doing that. A lot of powerlifters will do that. Now, obviously, in certain circumstances, we'll see these powerlifters inching down to hit that depth. But for a lot of people, if you're squatting kind of a full range of motion, it's generally a good idea to try and move faster. And especially if you're doing it for sport or anything, trying to move those weights on average faster is a good idea. Now, squatting down at speed where you feel like you're losing balance probably is a skill issue. So it could be a mobility issue. It could be a strength issue. For example, your quads could be kind of weak, so you're not as used to using them, which kind of comes back to a skill issue. You could be lacking mobility in a certain area, so you're not able to stay balanced. So you kind of need to look at where you're coming at this and what your problems might be. But one of the first places, again, is just familiarity with the lift. Even if you're super weak and really immobile, if you've done enough squatting after a while, you'll start to get a bit more confidence with that. So it's probably a combination of these. So without seeing your squat, you'll need to look at mobility. You'll need to look at specific site weakness. So your quad's really weak. Is your back really weak? Can you not maintain your lower back position? Or are you just kind of generally new to squatting? So it depends on a few areas, and you just need to kind of assess what is going on. So hopefully that narrows down what it might actually be. If you're just squatting for a year, if you're first time squatting seriously for a year, then skill is probably your main component here. But if it's been a couple of years and it's still not corrected, then try and have a look at that strength or skill aspect, or strength or mobility aspect.
What are the worst periodizations for combat athletes? And a smiling face afterwards. Undoubtedly, the worst tactic for periodizing a combat athlete is them constantly being a combat athlete. Combat sports, whether it be grappling, striking, whatever it is, are incredibly hard on the body. And we see it much more so in the amateur side of things, where combat sports athletes, BJJ, kickboxing, Muay Thai, whatever it is, stay in season all the time. Now, what I mean by being in season isn't necessarily that they're competing all year round or even doing a competition every 2 months, but they essentially stay in the same shape, doing the same training all the time. This means doing a small amount of gym work, probably 2 or 3 times per week, going to their sparring sessions and going pretty hard, maybe 3 or 4 times per week, and then never having a period of the year where they're taking a major step back from sparring, a major step back from their technical work, and really trying to force some physical adaptations. On the opposite side of this then would be the approach where you're going to be in competition shape 3 or 4 times per year. This still means that for the vast majority of your year, you're doing the things you enjoy, whether that's going to BJJ sparring sessions or Muay Thai bag sessions, and you're really getting to go hard. You're in that shape to be doing that skill as well as you possibly can for most of the year. But during those 3 or 4 off-season periods, which is probably 3 or 4 months of the year, you're able to give your body a bit of the rest. Whether it's a sore elbow or a sore neck from getting too many neck cranks, that's all going to be alleviated by those months off. So probably 1 in every 3 months you should be taking a major step back from the sparring. This is a conversation you can have with your coach, or maybe you don't even have to have it. You go from 4 sessions a week of heavy rolling down to 2 sessions per week, rather than going to those open mats where you're going to war for 8 or 10 rounds. You're now instead going to go to a fundamentals class and work on technique a small bit more. And most importantly, during those off-season periods, you're really hitting your strength work, your speed work, your power work, whatever it is you need to get the best outcomes possible for your sport.
Just watch the recent video on Special Forces prep. What are the Sika fitness standards for Special Forces? So we don't really have a general rule of thumb for Special Forces athletes. It usually depends on what branch they're going to or what their specific event. For example, someone might have specific swim stuff they need to do. Someone might have specific, anti-drowning stuff to do, but then they might also have an obstacle course complete, but they might Someone else might have a specific distance but under load to complete. So there's no real minimum standards that we have that we could give to people that wherever special forces or elite military unit you're going to, you could adhere to this. We could definitely write a program for sure. We could definitely write a very general program which would get you almost ready for any of those, and a little bit extra then would require some specialization. That would probably look like a lot of running. A baseline of strength, you're probably looking at 2 to 3 sessions per week in terms of strength training, but a lot of it will come down to, most of them have weighted runs, rucking or tabbing or whatever military you're in. You'll have a name for it, and you'll be looking at what distance do you need, how heavy do you need to go at that distance, what kind of paces do you need to hit. Then a lot of them will have body weight standards. Some of them are pretty achievable body weight standards. The chance there, if you're watching this, you could probably almost hit those body weight standards. Sometimes it'd be, you'll have a grading sheet, you'll have a certain number of scores and a minimum number of scores to hit, and it'll be like 50 push-ups in 2 minutes or something like that, or something that's pretty achievable for a lot of people when they're trained. And then other things will be quite tough. They'll be looking at maybe 10-minute miles with 20 kilos, 30 kilos more. Some excruciatingly heavy weights are seen sometimes in some of these trials. So standard is largely aerobic fitness is probably the main standard. Having a high level of aerobic fitness while you're running is probably one of those big things. And doing a lot of strength training to support this, a lot of leg work, a lot of back work, a lot of postural work will cover most of your bases. And so if you don't know what's going to come down the line in 2 years for special forces, that doesn't necessarily matter. What you can probably bet on now is that you need to be in good running shape. You need to be reasonably well acclimatized to running with a weight on your back. Get good running shape first. Be strong in the gym to a certain extent. We're not talking elite level strength numbers, but have a decent repertoire of strength behind you. And then what you'll actually see from a lot of these places is you'll get this kind of Chinese whispers from, maybe it's high command is telling you, they kind of want to let people know but not too specifically, or you'll have people in the unit already will often let people know. If you get to know someone, they'll say, look, get ready for some anti-drowning stuff, or get ready for some cold exposure, or get ready for some fitness stuff where you are also trying to navigate. So you'll hear whispers, some of it will be recorded or some of it will be on paper. So try and find out what it is that you're going for. Try and find out from people already there, or try and find out from your higher ups. Can you get a little bit of information? Sometimes they'll give it, and depending on your repertoire of people. So that's what I'd recommend. So we don't have a general fitness standard, because while they're all in the same bracket, the very specific end, the top of that pyramid, is quite different across a lot of them. So I would say, if I had to give a standard, it's aerobic fitness, weighted aerobic fitness, generally running, and then for a lot of them it's probably be good at swimming as well to a certain extent, or at least be comfortable in the water, cold water.
Would you recommend to run the bench program using a Smith machine if the gym has no safety pins? Absolutely not. The problem with running large aggressive blocks like the bench program, the squat program, the pull program, utilizing some sort of machine, or whether it's a Smith machine where you're still kind of moving the weight, but even a pulley machine like that, the glory or the kind of magic of the hyper aggressive programming is that it relies on you having some amount of skill learning and skill acquisition happening throughout, right? So if I take a bench press or I take a high bar back squat and I want to start off with a 140 kilo squat and I want to finish with a 170 kilo squat, obviously I'm gaining a small amount of muscle during that. Obviously that muscle is becoming more efficient. Obviously my neuromuscular system, my entire system, my central nervous system, peripheral nervous system is being trained to physically adapt throughout that training cycle. And so now I go from 140 kilos to 170 kilos. The problem is when we utilize a machine, a cable row, a Smith machine in this case, you're not really getting any skill acquisition going on. And so what happens is the initial test and the final test have essentially the exact same motor pattern, essentially the exact same level of skill. And so we're really just getting a slight bump up that comes from a small increase in muscle mass and a larger portion of that increase coming from that neuromuscular efficiency that we gain from strength training. What I'm talking about here basically is that program's going to be too aggressive. If you can squat or bench press 140 kilos now with a Smith machine, you're going to be going from a bench press of 140 to a bench press of 150 or 155 with a standard bench press program. If you're on the Smith machine, you're probably going to be going from 140 to 145 or 147. And it's just the slope of that line, how aggressively that progress happens, is the main differentiating factor when we have the added advantage of skill learning. So in your case, if you were to be going to a gym that doesn't have safety pins and you want to be bench pressing, my major piece of advice firstly would be get a training partner or just ask the people around you. If you're always going to be on your own, then maybe you do just need to go and get a different gym, find somewhere else to train. If that's not a possibility, I would be bench pressing with no clips on the end and just tilting those plates off one side if I do absolutely fail on the bench.
How to differentiate between overreaching, not recovering properly, all the way to being a bitch? So this is actually a very good question, and it comes down to, first of all, good programming. So overreaching is something that is based on the programming that you're following. So we can all immediately go into the gym and overreach. I can go in and load up 400 kilos and murder myself, or I can go in every day and squat for a 20 rep max non-stop continuously and mess myself up. So we're overreaching there, but we'd often hear a term known as functional overreaching, which again comes back to just smart programming. So when you trying to define overreaching and how do you facilitate it and what are you doing, that comes down to good programming, which obviously I can't answer for you right here. Now, under recovery or not recovering properly is something that is a very interesting term, and there comes down to what do we mean by the words we're using. And the way I like to think of recovery or not recovering properly is that for most people, we've a fairly consistent line of recoverability. There's a certain steady line. I like to imagine like a heart rate monitor in a hospital on a screen where you're just moving along at this line or on a graph or whatever you want to imagine. And your maximum recoverability is to reach this point. I call this maybe your kind of your 0 point, for example. And this is something that if you get enough sleep, if you're training smart, if you're doing more mobility, if you're doing correct nutrition, right hydration, supplements, all that you can do, this is kind of where you get to with this line. However, as soon as you start removing any of those, you start coming down just below this line. Maybe that's temporarily, maybe that's an extended period for however long you are not adhering to your good recovery abilities. But the funny thing is you can't really go above this line. You can't really get more than this line. You can certainly go take PEDs, but outside of PEDs, you can't really get this line to move up in any meaningful manner over a reasonable time period. You can't do something the same day and get above your maximum recoverable ability, assuming you're doing all the other stuff. Good thing is you're probably not doing all the other stuff. You're probably not hydrated. You're probably not eating as perfect as you could be. You're probably not sleeping enough. You're probably, if you're following a Sika Strength program, you're following the perfect program. But if you're not following a Sika Strength program, then you're probably running into issues somewhere. So I would look at all of these and see, is my programming taken care of? So my overreaching makes sense. Is my recoverability, is that all that covered? Am I doing all the things I should be? You probably aren't. I would say anyone could figure out some stuff that they're not doing. Check that off. And then the last one is actually quite difficult to answer. Like, when are you being a bitch? Most people, when they're seriously training and getting after it, are actually terrible at answering this question, and not in the way you might think. Usually people are way too harsh on themselves if they're really driven and are trying to push their training hard. Some people are on one end of the spectrum where they're way too soft and they don't train hard enough, and they're really hindered by any form of obstacle in their training, whether that be a missed set or the idea of a heavy set in a few weeks or a little pain. Some people are just total bitches when it comes to that. So that's where that don't be a bitch came about. But there's some people who train like motherfuckers and they just cannot answer this question honestly when they are overtrained or they're overreached in a short period of time and they're under facilitating the recovery. So you need to answer, is your programming making sense? Is your recovery making sense? And if both of those make sense, then you come into a session and you feel terrible and it's not working well, then you probably know that you're probably not being a bitch. Something has gone wrong. You've reached too far, or vice versa. Maybe you come in and you've done all those things. Your programming makes sense, your recovery makes sense, but you just don't feel like it. Then you might be a bitch. Whereas you come in and you didn't have enough sleep for 6 weeks in a row, or didn't eat enough food or whatever, then There's your answer.
Would deadlifting once per week help or hinder my gains, for example, while running the RTA 2.0? This really depends, and I've come to hate giving the "it depends" answer on here because I feel like a lot of the questions could be caveated with that. It really does depend though. What you're talking about here is, would it be detrimental to the squat outcome or the bench outcome or whatever the program you're trying to do? Let's take the squat as the example. There is a case to be made where the deficits in your squat could be helped by using the deadlift as an accessory piece, right? So that might be very poor posterior chain, that might be very weak hamstrings, very weak back, whatever it is. Posturally, you might struggle. And in the case where that's your particular deficit and you have the requisite amount of recovery capital left over from those 2 RTA sessions aren't fatiguing you overly, you're not doing a massive amount of other supplemental training, in that case, the deadlifting once per week could be helpful for your squat. Now, is that the point where most of us are at? Absolutely not. Most of us won't have a deficit in our squat that relies on the deadlift as an accessory piece. Most of our deficits won't be having a back that's too weak. It might be one particular portion of our back, like maybe our mid back or lower back or upper back extension isn't great, in which case there are better accessory movements to use. Most of us are also doing other supplemental training as we go along with the RTA. So we might be doing weightlifting or powerlifting alongside. We might be doing some high rocks or some CrossFit classes alongside. And in that case, the deadlift then becomes a poor accessory exercise because the deadlift is incredibly fatiguing. And I know you might be listening to this saying, oh, I'm only deadlifting once per week and I'll limit the total amount of weight used and I don't feel that fatigued. The unfortunate thing about the deadlift, in a similar way with the front squat, it's just very fatiguing on you. It's fatiguing on 2 particular areas that are problematic, and that being it's fatiguing on your midline, your back, your core, that essential conduit for power that goes from our lower to our upper body becomes fatigued when we deadlift. And the other way it's fatiguing is it's incredibly fatiguing on our central nervous system. So our ability to contract our muscles as hard as possible is being taken away from. So then it means that during the heavier squat sessions, I'm thinking about week 7, 8, 9, 10, as you go through that RTA 2.0, these are more difficult weeks where you'll really have to be concentrating very hard. You'll have to be contracting as hard as possible. Central nervous system fatigue isn't something where you're necessarily going to be feeling it when you get out of bed in the morning. It's not necessarily a type of fatigue that begins to feel as if it dissipates over the course of a warm-up. Central nervous system fatigue is the carbon monoxide of the modern training world, right? It's this kind of odorless, tasteless gas that can kill you. You don't really know if your central nervous system is overly fatigued. You might suddenly start noticing that you're not typing as fast as you previously were, or maybe as you go to hit that light switch, your finger doesn't really hit the right part of the light switch. Maybe it's difficult to relax or fall asleep in the evenings. And in that case, they're the kind of indications that fatigue could be occurring. So it's definitely something to be aware of. The final thing I would say is that in the case of using the deadlift as a helping or hindering or asking the question if it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing, there is merit in just taking it on the chin. And what I mean by that is, if you're somebody who really enjoys the deadlift, or you feel like the deadlift really helps you out in your paddle playing at the weekends, or maybe you feel like the deadlift makes you a better gardener when you go to do some work around the house, go and do the deadlift. Have an understanding that it mightn't be the optimal thing for you to do. It mightn't be the best possible thing, and maybe just for these 8 or 12 weeks you should be taking a step away from it. But don't try and justify it to yourself in a way where, oh, I'm doing the deadlift, I know it's not the best thing, and then name 4 or 5 reasons it might actually be helping you out. If you want to do something, go and do it, but do it with the explicit understanding that you understand it's not the best thing to do. Just say, I'm doing the deadlift, I'm going to do it once per week, and I'm doing it because I enjoy doing it, and that's absolutely fine.
100 kilo squat versus 180 kilo deadlift, what could be causing this? So what I would say here is there's probably 2 main things going on. One, you're probably predisposed to being better at deadlifting, and so that ratio is probably something that will never be 1-to-1 or will be super close. And the other then is probably just a maybe lack of understanding of how to do the back squat, how to do program for the back squat, how to address issues in the back squat. Because realistically, if you can deadlift 180 kilos, you can probably squat more. You just have that general strength to squat more than 100 kilos. 100 kilos is a very light squat. No offense to anyone who's squatting 100 kilos, but for a lot of people, that's not their max capacity. So what I'd say here is just running a good squat program. For this, I'd be looking at something like the RTA squat program on the app, 1 and 2. What I'd recommend here, the most straightforward answer that you could go do is quite literally go and run something like that and see if your squat doesn't catch up if you don't do 120 or 130 by the end of one of those programs. Because it's probably just a fact that you're good at deadlifting, but also you're under efforting on the squat. And a lot of times you'll see if someone's really good at deadlifting and they hate the squat, you'll see this divergence happening because they'll always kind of favor the deadlifts, and then when they have to do a squat program, they're like, oh, let's go into their squats, and it slowly becomes a kind of a bigger barrier, basically a bigger issue, because you spend more time doing the lift that you're naturally good at because it's progressing and you're naturally good at it, so it progresses easier. But then that fucking squat, and you just aren't very well predisposed for squatting, so it doesn't come easy, and then you start to see this kind of obstacles and this chain of events happening.
What kind of off-season is best for amateur weightlifters? How long should it be? In my opinion, there's 2 separate off-seasons a weightlifter should be doing, both of which have very different reasons behind them. The first one is a strength and hypertrophy off-season. This is going away and doing 8 weeks, 12 weeks of squats, really getting your strict press up there, maybe gaining 5 kilos with a good portion of that being muscle tissue. And this is the underage or developing athlete taking time out of weightlifting to really solidify themselves, really get stronger. That's the off-season most weightlifters think they need to do. In my opinion, and the word amateur is used here, so I'm going to lean into this a small bit more. In my opinion, most amateur weightlifters should be doing an off-season where they're doing something that looks very like CrossFit. In all of our training camps, in all of our seminars, the level of physical fitness seen in the general weightlifting population leaves a lot to be desired, which leads to a massive amount of time in between sets, leads to very ineffective warm-ups, leads to lack of ability to do multiple sets to really perfect technique, leads to having to cut sessions short because you've already been in the gym for 2.5 hours. And in my opinion, taking 6 or 8 weeks away from weightlifting and going to 4 sessions per week of high-intensity interval training will do wonders for your weightlifting. It doesn't mean that you don't have to snatch or clean and jerk at all during that off season. Absolutely. Still snatch once or twice per week. Definitely clean and jerk once per week. Stay in touch with the lifts. Make sure you limit yourself to around 75 to 80% of 1RM during those technique sessions, for want of a better term. But then for the rest of your time and the rest of your training, you're just making yourself as tired as you possibly can. I don't mean going and doing curls. I don't mean going to a machine row and doing a load of machine rows. You're not doing bodybuilding, or you should not be doing bodybuilding. In my opinion, the best off-season a lot of weightlifters and a lot of amateur weightlifters in particular should be doing is doing those workouts. 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, air bike sprints. Maybe it's 10 reps of deadlift, 10 reps of box step-ups, 10 reps of burpees over the rower, and then you do 500 meters on the rower. You do 5 rounds of that, or you do 20 minutes of as many rounds as possible of that. These are the kind of sessions you should be doing. This will give you the biggest leg up in weightlifting you could possibly imagine. It's something where we spoke earlier about the deadlift making you fatigued and you don't even know it's fatiguing your central nervous system. Lack of good conditioning, lack of being in pretty good shape for weightlifting is something that really hinders your progress. It really hinders your ability to perfect technique and carry on good technique longer into training blocks without you ever realizing it. You just think that's normal. You think it's normal to sit down for most of the session. Sitting down is important and effective rest is important, but you shouldn't need that much rest. You'll see a lot of very good weightlifters will drop the barbell on a 150 kilo snatch and they'll pace around the room for a minute to a minute and a half and they'll be ready for their next set again. This amount of work capacity is really what you should be striving for. You shouldn't be incredibly fatigued after one set of 5 on the squats. Even if that set of 5 is at 80% of 1 rep max, it shouldn't be putting you on your hold for 5 minutes. What it should be is 90 seconds to 2.5 minutes of rest. That rest doesn't necessarily have to be sat down, but these are the levels of work capacity you should be striving for.
Bench press for weightlifting, is it worth it or is it too much effort essentially? So they said not enough bang for the buck. So there's two groups that bench press is really useful for in weightlifting. That is ute male and female weightlifters, and then there is female lifters of all ages. So usually both of these groups lack some stability in the upper body. They lack enough muscle mass, or rather could do with more stability and muscle mass. And the bench press is an exercise that works really well to move a lot of weight for the upper body in a pretty safe fashion, in a consistent fashion, in an easily loaded and progressed fashion. So it usually solves that problem really well. Strict press is really useful also for both these groups, but sometimes a bench press with that extra weight can be very useful. For example, if you get a female lifter, sometimes pressing 40 kilos can be really hard, whereas doing multiple sets with 40 kilos in the bench press or 50 kilos can make a really big difference there for those female or youth athletes. So bench press in those groups can be really useful. For the grown male lifter, it's never the best solution to the problem, but can be done if you wanted to. Strict press is better. Snatch grip, push press, snatch grip, strict press, behind the neck press, push press, behind the neck push press are all much more useful options when you're trying to improve what you're trying to improve for the bench press. However, in some cases, people just really want the bench press with their training. Now, I know in scenarios we hear the Soviets used to say, I've never actually seen this written down anywhere, but I've heard it said that the Soviets liked that you should be able to bench your snatch. And we've certainly seen a lot of the even modern day Russian weightlifters benching huge weights, 180, 200. We've even seen Lasha benching. So it's not that the bench is a bad idea, but it typically can take a small bit away from your upper body mobility. Not a huge amount, but it definitely does seem to affect people. And in most cases, people need more mobility in the upper body, certainly the male grown adult group. So it's not really a fatigue thing, it's more of an impact your mobility thing. So I'd be cautioning against it, but if you really want to do it, you can add it in. It will give you some benefits.
I'm mainly doing 4x6 and 4x4 in 3-week blocks. Should I be doing 4x10? Main goal is strength on the big lifts. This is a super common question. This is the same question as saying, how long should I do 5x5 for, or what do you think of the 5x5 program? Nobody should be holding on to reps or particular sets and reps and giving it any more credit as if they're any more effective than any other random mix of numbers. The big thing with our programming, when you're looking at strength, particularly in the big lifts, squat, bench and deadlift, you need to be accruing a lot of volume and then over the course of a training cycle, tapering that volume down and increasing the weights as you go through it. So in terms of doing 4x6 and 4x4 in 3-week blocks, you're probably spending too long in that 6s and 4s category. You should just be doing 2 weeks where you do 10s. So let's say that's 4 or 6 sessions of 10s. 2 weeks where you do 8s. So that's 4 or 6 sessions of 8s. Then 2 weeks of 6s, 2 weeks of 4s, 2 weeks of 3s, 2s and 1s. And then a few weeks of 2s and 1s in a heavy kind of peak at the end. That's as complicated as programming is. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. You don't need to think about it any more than that. A lot of the time people will try and match their sets and reps range to the relative work they need to do in their sport. So they'll try and look at the amount of strides in the start position or the starting portion of a sprint. They might look at the amount of strokes they do in the pool. They might look at the amount of strokes they do on a rower in a particular race. What we're really looking to do is if we're using the squat to get a bigger squat, then all that matters is getting that 1RM number at the end higher. I don't need to worry about anything that happens in between, and all I do is stick to the accrue a lot of volume, then over the course of a cycle, I gradually bring the volume down, and then I start with low intensity, and over the course of that training block, I bring the intensity up. At the moment, your volume line is essentially staying the same throughout the entire time. I know you say you do that for 3 weeks and then reset, but generally speaking, around 2 weeks with a certain rep range is good. So that 2, 4, 6 session kind of bracket, move on then. So in this case, if you've done 4x6 and 4x4, then I will be going on to 6x3 or 6x2, then 4x2. And the final piece on this then is do not be afraid to manipulate the amount of sets to make up a small jump in intensity that might be happening. So what do I mean by that? Let's take the 4x6 and 4x4 example. If you had done 4x6 at 80 kilos and then 4x4 at 90 kilos, and next week you're going to be doing 4x6 at 95 or 97.5 kilos. That's obviously quite a jump. What can make that easier is instead you go for 3x6 or 2x6 at that new weight, and then maybe the second session that week is 4x6. So those small manipulations, or those smaller manipulations of loading, allows us to force adaptation, allows us to force increases in intensity or increases in volume by very slowly turning that volume dial. The volume dial gets turned quite quickly when I go from 4s to 6s or 6s to 8. Changing the amount of sets you have to do in a session makes a massive difference. Not so much how difficult that individual set is, but just how difficult or achievable that session is going to be in itself.
I have excessive lean forward coming out of the hole in squats. How do I fix this? So this is an issue with, as you squat down, you are incorrectly adjusting somewhere, your technique is an issue, or on the way up, you're incorporating the wrong squat pattern. You're doing the wrong thing with your squat. Now, this could be from a couple of different issues. It could be a mobility issue or a strength or a skill issue or the three of those combined. What usually happens here is lifters will squat down. They might squat down correctly. Let's say they come down in a relatively consistent back angle, or some lifters will squat down and the back angle will change as they get into the bottom position. So if we take the first star, you squat down, you have a consistent back angle. What might happen here, what usually happens, is we'll see that immediate shift back. However, the first place you can start looking is if you don't have a consistent back angle as you squat down, you're adding this momentum to that movement you don't want to do. So instead of coming down like this, you end up coming down at more of an angle as you squat all the way down. So you're leaning forward as the rep continues. So in this scenario, you need to look at your quad, hip, and ankle mobility and strength. You need to look at your back strength here and see what's causing that issue. Are they weak? Are they not up to par? So you should be able to sit down with a really consistent angle. Some small change is fine, but in terms of that overall back angle, if that's not staying consistent on the descent, that's probably where your issue is coming from. Then if we get to the bottom with a consistent back angle, but we immediately shoot back, this lets us know that it's probably not a mobility issue, because if you can get into that position, then it's probably a strength or a skill issue. So what you need to focus on here is if you've come down correctly, you are probably just not driving those knees forward as you stand up. This is probably one of the most common issues, whereas people get to the bottom and they'll immediately let those knees come back. They'll let that shin angle come to vertical. Their hips will scoop backwards. They'll go in this kind of arc instead of going in this relatively straight line, and we'll get this forward out of the whole squat. Sometimes this will also happen is when people are squatting down, they aren't focusing on driving it forward, so our back angle is staying consistent, but on the bottom, we're not putting a lot of tension on our legs to be pushing in that forward direction. So when we get to the bottom, we're in this kind of loose position, and we immediately get those hips shifting back. Now, because assuming you're getting into that position, it might not be mobility. So a lot of times you'll see people with tight ankles, for example, won't be able to keep those knees forward, whether that's high bar or low bar squatting. And so when they stand up, they're not able to push those knees far enough forward. And as a result, those hips have to go backwards and shoot up out of the hole in the squat, and that kind of stripper style squat, or that good morning style squat, which is definitely something we don't want.
Is there a ceiling to your aerobic progress as much as there is with strength or hypertrophy? Absolutely. I think we don't commonly mull over how freakish the aerobic athletes are, how different people who are incredibly aerobic trained are from the standard people, because we don't really see it, right? Gurf has a big squat. Gurf walks around with massive quads and a big back up in him. A bodybuilder is in great shape, and you'll see it as they walk around the place because they hold 4 times more muscle in their upper shoulder than you do probably in your upper body. In the aerobic world, the freakishness continues, but it is far more hidden than you could ever imagine. You might start to see brief glimpses of how far ahead some aerobic people are, or how different their ceiling is to yours when you start looking at resting heart rates, or how viscous their blood is, or how long it will take them to actually start exhibiting some signs of stress when they're doing aerobic training. But what I would say is the difference between a 200 kilo squatter and a 300 kilo squatter absolutely exists in the running world, and it's probably the difference between a 430 kilometer and a 330 kilometer. Those gaps definitely exist. I think as running becomes more and more popular, and it's funny, I'm listening to Phil Knight's book on founding Nike, and he talks about running suddenly becoming popular in the kind of 60s and 70s in the US. Running is definitely getting another resurgence in the last 3 or 4 years since the lockdowns and stuff like that caused people to try and get outside as much as they possibly could. And I think we're seeing some of this become more commonly thought about in the general spheres of things, as people are comparing their run times after maybe 6 or 8 months of training to the run times of some elite athletes, or even the run times of their friends who are just more genetically predisposed to better running. You start seeing those differences. I think the final thing to consider here is that although there is different ceilings for everyone, there's different ceilings for everyone in every single aspect. So in terms of your strength, your power, your speed, your aerobic capacity, all of these ceilings exist, but it is by no means a reason not to go out and train your aerobic system as best you possibly can. I really like people to be in as good an aerobic shape as they can possibly be. This worry of it killing your gains or it not being as fun as anything else, whatever about that, you aren't going to lose your muscle mass because you're doing a bit of running or a bit of rowing or a bit of bike erg work 3 or 4 times a week. You're not going to suddenly become this kind of skinny, fat hippie who likes to go and run, but it will make an absolutely gigantic difference to your strength training.